Mission Control Houston at NASA's Johnson International Space Station Flight Control Room as we begin our undocking coverage for SpaceX's 32nd commercial resupply services mission for NASA to the space station.
But anyway, in preparation for undock, we're going to have you perform step 1 of 1.303, crew monitoring of ACS moding for Dragon departure. Undock sequence start time 1600 GMT.
In about 5 minutes, the NASA flight control team here in Mission Control
go to perform step 1 and 1600 undock.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Vapor.
And the SpaceX team in Hawthorne, California will conduct a go-no-go poll for undocking of the Dragon cargo spacecraft from the Zenith port or space-facing port of the station's Harmony module. NASA and SpaceX waved off yesterday's undocking attempt due to unfavorable weather in the splashdown zone, and after a weather briefing earlier this morning, weather is looking excellent in that splashdown zone today. Dragon's departure from the space station is at approximately 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. Eastern Time. With no crew on board, the Dragon cargo spacecraft is ready to return to Earth, expecting to splash down off the coast of California on Sunday, May 25th at approximately 12:45 a.m. Central Time, 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time, carrying scientific experiments and critical hardware for teams and researchers on the ground. NASA will not be live on air for splashdown, but you can keep up with the spacecraft status on the space station and on social media. Here on the ground in Houston, Flight Director Elias Mirmo is overseeing today's spacecraft departure. His role today is to lead and work closely with his team of flight controllers on the ground as they work integrated operations with the SpaceX team in Hawthorne. Today's Capcom, or capsule communicator who you see to Mirmo's right, is Jacob Lestarge on console. Capcom serves as the primary communication between Mission Control and the crew on board the station. You will hear Lestarge's voice during today's operation communicating with NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, who is currently aboard the space station. Kim will be monitoring the departure of the Dragon cargo spacecraft from the cupola, a small room aboard the International Space Station that has plenty of windows and a workstation with data screens. From there, Kim will be able to get a great view of Dragon and is ultimately acting as a second set of eyes for the mission control teams today. Kim also monitored the arrival and docking of the Dragon cargo spacecraft following its launch to the space station about a month ago, alongside Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi. Check out this image from the cupola that Johnny shared to social media. Speaking of docking, let's take a moment to recap this mission's launch and arrival as we look ahead to its departure from the space station. The CRS-32 mission launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket from the NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida on April 21st and delivered more than 3 tons of new science, food, supplies, and equipment to the Expedition 73 crew living and working aboard the International Space Station. About 10 minutes after launch, the Dragon cargo spacecraft separated from the second or upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket into its preliminary orbit and began its journey to the orbital outpost. Following a 16.5-hour transit, the forward nose cap on the Dragon then opened to expose the docking mechanism and autonomously docked to the zenith port, or the space-facing port, of the space station's Harmony module on April 22nd. The spacecraft carried hardware including water recycling systems, a handheld tool that makes grabbing hard-to-reach items easier, 2 spare oxygen tanks for emergency scenarios, and a thermal expansion device for water. If you are just now joining us, we are providing live coverage of undocking SpaceX's 30-second commercial resupply services mission for NASA to the space station. NASA and SpaceX integrated operation teams have pulled go for undocking at 10:50 a.m. Central Time, 11:50 a.m. Eastern Time. NASA Flight Director Elias Mirmo consulted with his flight control team about today's undocking procedures, and we are right on track for an undock command expected in approximately 10 minutes. This command will start the undocking process, starting with the opening of the hooks, which should take about 5 minutes.
Johnny Houston on 2, we copy.
Again, that undocking is scheduled for approximately 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. Eastern Time, from the zenith port of the station's Harmony module. To give you an idea of where that zenith port is, you can see on your screen the CRS-32 Cargo Dragon spacecraft is currently docked to the space-facing port of the Harmony module. And right below it is the Dragon spacecraft that carried NASA's SpaceX Crew 10 to the space station, with NASA astronauts Anne McClain, Nicole Ayers, and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. And this vehicle is docked to that forward-facing port of the same module. SpaceX will send the command to undock in about 8 minutes or so. The umbilicals will retract and 2 sets of 6 hooks will open. The umbilicals are from the station at the docking port and provides power to the visiting vehicle. Umbilical retraction disconnects station's power systems from the spacecraft, resulting in Dragon operating on autonomous power. And again, there are 12 hooks in total, 2 groups of 6. We should get confirmation of those hooks opening after the undock command from our VVO or Visiting Vehicle Officer here in Mission Control Houston. Once all of the hooks have opened, Dragon will ultimately push away from the International Space Station and begin its journey back to Earth, splashing down off the coast of California Sunday morning, May 25th, returning critical science and hardware to NASA and its international partners. While we are waiting for those milestones, let's go ahead and look at some of those experiments on board Dragon today. Astro B Reach, or Responsive Engaging Arms for Captive Care and Handling, is returning to Earth after successfully demonstrating grasping and relocating capabilities on board the space station. Reach used Astro B robots to demonstrate technology for capturing space objects of different geometry or surface materials using tentacle-like arms and adhesive pads. This experiment is a way to safely capture and relocate debris and other objects in orbit and could help address end-of-life satellite servicing, orbit change maneuvers, and debris removal. These capabilities maximize satellite lifespan, and they protect assets and infrastructure in low Earth orbit, including the space station and the satellites that provide services to people here on Earth. Books from the Storytime in Space project are returning on the Dragon cargo spacecraft after being read by astronauts in space. Storytime in Space combined science literacy outreach with simple demonstrations recorded aboard the space station. Crew members filmed themselves reading 5 science, technology, engineering, and mathematics related children's books in orbit and completed science experiments to go along with them. Video and data collected during the demonstrations were downlinked to the ground and posted in a video library with accompanying education materials for students. Samples have been retrieved from the MISSI, or Multi-Purpose International Space Station Experiment platform on the exterior of the space station, helping to improve knowledge of how materials respond to ultraviolet radiation, charged particles, thermal cycling, and many other factors in the vacuum of space. This experiment exposed many different materials to space, including radiation shielding and detection materials, solar sails, and reflective coatings, and even ceramic composites for reentry vehicle studies and resins for potential use in heat shields. In just a few minutes, we should be receiving that undock command for the Dragon cargo spacecraft to begin its departure and return to Earth, bringing home science and hardware for teams of researchers on the ground. With NASA astronaut Johnny Kim monitoring the separation and departure of the CRS-32 mission from the International Space Station, he will have a great vantage point and, if needed, will be able to visually confirm that the spacecraft has separated from the station in the event we can't get the best views of Dragon. And after that separation, Kim will continue to monitor Dragon and ensure that the spacecraft is performing nominally during the early stages of departure. And we are 2 minutes away from that undock command. And again, this undock command will start the undocking process, and this will start with the opening of the hooks. We have 2 sets of 12 hooks in total, and for all 12 of those hooks to open, it should take about 5 minutes, so it's a fairly quick process. With these opening of the hooks, that will basically put Dragon in autonomous power and retract Dragon from using the International Space Station's power. Thus, Dragon will be on its journey back home. And the command undock has been sent. The umbilicals will retract, marking the Dragon's power separation from the space station and start of autonomous power from batteries generated through solar cells. And we have confirmation that both umbilicals have retracted and the first set of hooks are starting to open. Again, there are 2 sets of 6 hooks, making 12 in total that will be open today. And this is a fairly quick step in Dragon's departure procedures, only taking a few minutes to fully open. After all 12 hooks are open, we will undergo a series of 4 burns that will ultimately set Dragon on the correct path to return home. Each of these burns are fairly quick burns, but mighty burns that will push Dragon into the keep out sphere and then beyond past the approach ellipsoid. And we should be getting confirmation here shortly of the first set of hooks closing, or excuse me, opening. And at this time, we are in orbital nighttime, so you can see a view of Dragon right here on your screen. It's that light that's on the Dragon spacecraft itself. And we have received confirmation that the first set of hooks are now open, and the second set is now underway.
Station copies.
Again, at this time, we are awaiting confirmation of the completion of the opening of the second hooks. The second set of hooks has 6 hooks, making 12 total after those 2 sets have opened. If you are just now joining us, we are live from the International Space Station Flight Control Room here in Mission Control, Houston, providing coverage for the undocking of SpaceX's 32nd commercial resupply services mission for NASA to the space station. And we have received confirmation that all hooks are open.
Station Houston, all hooks are open.
Station copies.
And we received confirmation that all 12 hooks are now open. We have a confirmed separation of the Dragon cargo spacecraft, carrying thousands of pounds of science and hardware back home at 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. a.m. Eastern Time. Dragon's docking occurred as the space station and the spacecraft were flying approximately 260 statute miles above the Earth. Dragon and the International Space Station are currently flying over northeast Australia. That's 260 statute miles above. We are now awaiting the completion of Depart Burn 0.
Station Houston, Dragon departure burn 0 complete.
Station copy.
The 2 depart burns following Dragon's physical separation from the space station, which occurred just seconds ago, will ultimately push Dragon on its path past the keep out sphere and eventually the approach ellipsoid. We are now awaiting completion of Depart Burn 0.
Station ISS thrusters enabled.
Houston copies, ISS thrusters enabled.
The next burn comes just seconds after that first burn. This next burn will increase the initial opening rate between Dragon and the space station, maneuvering Dragon towards the keep out sphere and eventually the approach ellipsoid. If you are just now joining us, the Dragon cargo spacecraft has separated from the International Space Station. That undocking took place at 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. Eastern Time, while Dragon and the International Space Station were flying 260 statute miles above Northeast Australia. Dragon is now maneuvering towards the keep out sphere and eventually the approach ellipsoid, and here you can see a good visual on your screen. These are two imaginary boundaries around the space station. The first is called the keep out sphere, which is like the neighborhood of the space station. Once Dragon passes that keep out sphere, it will then travel further out and pass the approach ellipsoid, which will ultimately set the Dragon cargo spacecraft up for its journey back to our blue marble. These are essentially safety boundaries that require go, no-go polls used in the unlikely event that something goes wrong with Dragon. The keep out sphere and approach ellipsoid are another chance to confirm that all of the guidance, navigation, and control systems are working correctly on Dragon before officially moving away from the International Space Station. Once Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, we will be out of joint operations with SpaceX and their mission control team in Hawthorne, California, that you can see on the left side of your screen. Will continue to monitor the rest of Cargo Dragon's autonomous flight through splashdown, which again is scheduled for Sunday, May 25th at 12:45 a.m. Central Time, 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time off the coast of California. NASA will not be providing live coverage of splashdown, but you can keep up with Dragon on the space station blog as well as on the agency's social media accounts. And we just received confirmation that we are currently undergoing depart burn 1. This will last about 22 seconds. And we have just received confirmation that the burn was nominal. We had a nominal second departure burn. Now the Dragon cargo spacecraft is moving through that keep out sphere. That is again the first of the two safety boundaries.
Station Houston on 2, departure burn 1 complete.
And we are 1 minute away from Dragon exiting that keep out sphere.
Station copy. And can you guys give us GMT time for Beaver crossing?
Copy, we'll work on that. It might be just a little bit, but copy that.
The next burn that Dragon will undergo is the Depart 2 burn. That'll be in about 45 minutes, So we will be out of joint operations with SpaceX, and we won't be live for that coverage. The Dragon will be on its way back to Earth with a splashdown expected on Sunday, May 25th at 12:45 a.m. Central Time, 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time.
Station Houston, Dragon has exited the keep-out sphere.
And there you heard it. The Dragon cargo spacecraft has exited the keep-out sphere. And the next milestone flight controllers are looking out for is the approach ellipsoid exit, which we should expect at 11:24 a.m. Central Time, 12:24 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will pave the path for the spacecraft and essentially mark its official return back to Earth. The Dragon cargo spacecraft is about 254 meters away from the International Space Station right now. If you are just joining us, you are watching live coverage of the undocking of SpaceX's 32nd commercial resupply services mission for NASA to the International Space Station. After a month-long stay docked to the orbiting laboratory, the mission delivered over 3 tons of science, food, supplies, and hardware to the 7-member Expedition 73 crew living and working aboard the International Space Station. The Dragon cargo spacecraft undocked from the Zenith port or space-facing port of the station's Harmony module at 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. Eastern Time, while Dragon and the International Space Station were flying 260 statute miles above Northeast Australia. This particular Dragon cargo spacecraft is no stranger to the International Space Station, as it previously flew 4 cargo resupply missions for NASA, including the 22nd, 24th, 27th, and 30th missions, with its most recent flight being March of last year. Some of the science coming home on this mission include samples from the exterior of the space station that tested the response of various materials in the vacuum of space, a robotic technology that used tentacle-like arms and adhesive pads to test capturing of different objects in microgravity, and even some STEM books that have been read by astronauts for students, and those things are all making their way back down to Earth, along with thousands of pounds of critical hardware, science, and cargo. And while we're waiting for the confirmation that Dragon has exited that approach ellipsoid, let's take a look at the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. They welcomed the Dragon cargo spacecraft a little over a month ago. They are living and working aboard the orbiting laboratory performing critical science and technology demonstrations, and they are a 7-member crew. NASA astronauts Anne McClain, Nicole Ayers, and Johnny Kim, who is monitoring today's departure, as well as JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky are all members of the Expedition 73 crew. NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, who is monitoring today's Dragon undocking from the cupola, arrived to the space station on April 8th, just a few weeks before the CRS-32 cargo Dragon arrived.
Station Houston on 2 for next V-bar crossing.
Station on 2, go ahead.
Hey, so we're estimating the next V-bar crossing will be at about 1710 GMT, 12 kilometers aft.
Okay, 1710 GMT, 12 kilometers aft. Thanks.
Good read.
At this time, we are coming to you live with live coverage of SpaceX's 32nd commercial resupply services mission for NASA to the International Space Station. Dragon is currently making its way past the Keep Out Sphere and eventually past the Approach Ellipsoid. Eventually, it will be set on its journey back home to Earth, returning critical science and hardware to NASA and its international partners. After the Dragon cargo spacecraft splashes down, marking the end of its month-long journey to and from the space station, recovery teams will be on the splashdown site off the coast of California to quickly retrieve Dragon and its contents with minimal exposure to Earth's gravity. There are even small refrigerators inside of the spacecraft that keep some of these scientific samples fresh so that they can be one of the first things removed when Dragon is back on Earth. And again, that splashdown is expected Sunday morning, May 25th at approximately 12:45 a.m. Central Time, 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time. And we will not be live on NASA Plus for splashdown, but to keep up with Dragon and its next milestones, be sure to check out the Space Station blog and the agency's social media accounts. In just a few minutes, we should be receiving confirmation that Dragon is exiting the approach ellipsoid, that second of those two imaginary safety boundaries surrounding the International Space Station. And here is that great visual again on your screen of these boundaries as we get closer to saying farewell to Dragon on its journey home. That first boundary closest to the space station is called the Keep Out Sphere, which is like the neighborhood of the space station. Dragon passed that first safety boundary or the Keep Out Sphere a few minutes ago. And now Dragon is heading towards the Approach Ellipsoid and will travel past that boundary to ultimately maneuver the cargo spacecraft in the right path, eventually returning thousands of pounds of science and hardware back home. In the unlikely event that something goes wrong with the Dragon spacecraft after undocking, these boundaries act as the checkpoints before we move forward with returning procedures and ensuring the safety of the spacecraft and cargo aboard. At this time, the Dragon cargo spacecraft has just surpassed 800 meters, far away from the International Space Station, and once it hits 1,000 meters away from the International Space Station, it has officially passed the approach ellipsoid. The CRS-32 mission launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida on April 21st and delivered more than 3 tons of new science, food, and supplies to the Expedition 73 crew who are living and working aboard the International Space Station. Following a 16-and-a-half-hour transit to the orbiting laboratory, Dragon then autonomously docked to the zenith port, or the space-facing port, of the space station's Harmony module the next day on April 22nd. It carried hardware including a water recycling system, a handheld tool that makes grabbing hard-to-reach items easier, 2 spare oxygen tanks for emergency scenarios, and a thermal expansion device for water. At this time, we are standing by to receive confirmation that the Dragon cargo spacecraft has passed the approach ellipsoid, making its journey back home to Earth after a month-long stay aboard the International Space Station. And we have confirmation that Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid. Dragon is now over 1,000 meters away from the International Space Station. Critical science and hardware are officially on their way to researchers and teams on the ground to benefit humanity.
Houston on 2, Dragon is outside the approach ellipsoid on a 24-hour safe, free drift trajectory.
Station copies, thanks.
Thank you.
And there you heard that confirmation again. Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid, and critical science and hardware are officially on their way to researchers and teams on the ground to benefit humanity and the future of human spaceflight as we travel further to the moon and eventually Mars. Dragon has now moved outside of the keep-out sphere and outside of the approach ellipsoid, the 2 major milestones that take the spacecraft outside of the neighborhood of the space station, and has undergone a series of 4 burns that have ultimately pushed Dragon on the correct path to begin its journey to splashdown off the coast of California on Sunday, May 25th, and that splashdown is expected at 12:45 a.m. Central Time, 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, NASA will not be covering splashdown live, but you can keep up with the Dragon's milestones on the space station blog as well as the agency's social media accounts. Joint coverage between NASA's International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston and SpaceX's Mission Control in Hawthorne, California has concluded now. The SpaceX team will continue to monitor the Dragon cargo spacecraft through its next milestones and burns as it makes its way to splashdown. After delivering over 3 tons of food, supplies, hardware, and critical cargo to the 7-member Expedition 73 crew on board the space station, the Dragon cargo spacecraft has successfully undocked, and that undocking was at 11:05 a.m. Central Time, 12:05 p.m. Eastern Time, while Dragon and the International Space Station were flying 260 statute miles over northeast Australia. Dragon is now on its way home, concluding this particular Dragon's 5th cargo mission. Thank you for joining us this morning as we follow the departure of the Dragon cargo spacecraft for SpaceX's 32nd commercial resupply mission for NASA to the International Space Station. This is Mission Control Houston.